that's when you start to really kind of create a discipling culture, right? Because they see the bigger picture, that the goal of this isn't to just satisfy and check the boxes and fulfill the structure, but you do lay out a structure to help people experience the discipleship, the relationship, the life change that you want them to experience as disciples.
Welcome to Divine Renovation's Missional Leadership Podcast. Here's your host, Tammy LeBlanc.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Rob. Welcome to another session of our podcast.
It's great to be here today. It's good to see both of you guys.
I'm all flanneled up. I'm ready to go.
There you go.
And you're looking very Canadian today, Matt.
I am, eh?
Indeed. And welcome to you, our listeners. We pray that today's conversation will be another step to helping you on your journey towards renewal. So, guys, in my office here, my office space faces a window that overlooks my front street. And I'm finding in the run of a day, I am seeing Amazon trucks going up and down my street quite regularly. Are you guys Amazon shoppers?
We are, yes. And
I hate to admit
it. Well, I should say we as in my family. I shouldn't say we as in me and Matt. I'm not trying to speak for Matt there. So,
well, I think the problem is most of those Amazon trucks pull down my street and stop at my house, which makes me feel a little guilty when I promise it's a need I have, not just a toy. So,
Okay. So, what is the latest thing that you've bought on Amazon?
Well, you're not going to believe this because we did not talk about this ahead of time, just for clarity, right? We did not set this up ahead of time. Sitting here on my desk. You ready? I'm going to show you what I got from Amazon, because what I got from Amazon and what I ordered from Amazon are two different things.
Oh.
It is a spaceship necklace.
Okay.
Spaceman, an astronaut necklace. Sorry.
Okay, so describe it, Matt, for those people that are listening and not watching.
It is a silver chain with a little astronaut hanging on it. And it's not what I ordered. I actually had to order a small end table for my office, and an astronaut necklace showed up instead.
Okay. Somebody's playing a prank on you.
I don't have any idea what's going on. That's my job today, is to figure out if another Amazon truck has to come pick that back up and take it away.
Well, I'm just wondering, you should go around and knock on your neighbors' doors, because maybe they just, had the wrong address, and your neighbors right now are really wondering where their necklace is.
It's addressed to me, though. That's the problem.
Okay, so it is right. Okay. Yeah.
How about you, Robert, for saying anything exciting off Amazon lately?
Well, it probably won't surprise too many people, but yeah, recently I just had a book delivered from Amazon, so I know that'll. So,
no.
Anyways, yeah. So,
yes, Rob is a big reader. Can I ask what this book is that you're going to read?
It is actually on how brain science affects discipleship. And so we're learning all kinds about like how the brain functions now and all that, and like the whole biblical concept of renewing your mind. There's just a ton of new evidence that's coming out that shows the ability for the mind to change. And so a lot of thinkers now in kind of both the theological and brain space or brain science space are, kind of thinking through the implications of what that means for us as disciples of Jesus. And it's fascinating, exciting, and I'll stop there because the podcast today is about something completely different. But anyways, so.
Well, before can I change my answer now that he's made it sound so cool and smart? I mean, we're gonna have a better answer than an astronaut necklace.
Well, I have to say that I thought my answer was kind of lame compared to yours, right? Like so.
As Matt sits up looking very proud, my latest purchase is related to, I don't know, a device, a tool, an appliance, I don't even know what you call it, that has opened up a whole new world to me that I had no idea even existed. But it was a friend, actually a colleague that we work with, that introduced me to this. And it's called a Cricut. Have you guys heard of a Cricut?
Yeah. Yeah, my wife has a Cricut.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
Okay, so what I understand it to be is it's a cutting tool, but people use it for the crafting world. And so you can make all kinds of things on this machine by putting different mediums, I guess, into it and cutting out patterns and stuff that you design. So my husband attended a men's conference where the theme was Yeshua. And he came home with this really cool mug that had in big bold letters, Yeshua. And so that was kind of my inspiration for my first craft on this Cricut was to print out, design, I guess, a t-shirt first with, I put in big bold letters, Yeshua across it. And then below it, who was, who is to come. So I've been having kind of fun with that. All to say that my latest purchase was another piece of equipment in this Cricut world because it's so massive and there's so many things to buy and expand what you can do and whatnot. So I'm expecting that package to arrive perhaps today as I look out my window while we're recording.
I'm really changing my answer now. I gave the lamest one of all.
So guys, how are we going to pull this back into our conversation that we're going to have today? I think I'm going to lean into Rob's answer because he mentioned disciples. And so today we're talking about making disciples for a parish that's going from maintenance to mission and starting to look outward. How do we make disciples? What are the areas, I guess, where parishes might not be looking at this right? The commission, of course, for the Catholic Church or for the church in general, actually, is to go out and make disciples. So what does that look like? How do we do that? Matt, I love the way you phrased it, where the Catholic Church has a lot of beautiful points that need to be connected, meaning we offer a lot of sacraments, per se. And a sacrament helps a person in a point or at a particular time to grow in discipleship. But how do we connect the dots between the sacraments? Do you want to help jump in here and frame that discussion a little bit?
Yeah, sure. That's a great way to start, right? And I think that's the good news. So everybody listening, if you're working at, employed at, volunteering at, serving at a Catholic church, you've got a lot of great dots to work with. I mean, speaking of your little Cricut device, right? It's like an aid to help you make better artwork. Well, when my kids started doing art, right, there was like a paint by numbers or a connect the dots, and you never could see the whole picture, right? At first, it just looked like a collection of dots. And I think, here's the bad news, is in the church, that's still what our picture looks like, is like a paint by numbers or a connect the dots that's not filled out. Because, see, a lot of times, we don't see the puzzle picture on the box, right? Like we don't see what the picture's supposed to look like before we start building it. Okay. Because we lack a vision. We don't really know where we're going. We just get really busy. We do all the things that we've always done. And all of these things are awesome things, right? They're sacramental grace. They're the sacraments of the church. They're what bring us closer to Jesus. It's like heaven and earth colliding at these dots. So the dots are a big deal. But I don't think we know yet how to connect them. So everything is still this like paint by numbers picture, and we can't see the picture. And I think maybe a starting point for looking at discipleship is just, again, how many times do we talk about this in coaching? Like, what's your vision? What's your vision for the future? Paint me that picture of where you want to go, where you want to take people, why you exist. Because then you can start to say, okay, if that's where we're going, if the puzzle has the picture on the box, that's what we want to build. We start one dot or one puzzle piece at a time, and you start connecting them, right? And in an intentional way that helps form disciples. Because until then, I think our church is just playing sacramental hopscotch. I don't know, is hopscotch a game they play in Canada?
It totally is. Yep.
Maybe not anymore, right? Kids probably
you might have
play
to,
that on their phone.
The 30 and under might have to Google that. But anyways,
that's good homework. Google hopscotch. Because what we do, right, is like somebody comes to us and says, hey, we want to have our kid baptized. And really the only question we ask is, well, were you baptized? Are you a member of this church? And we hand them the sheet that tells them the guidelines and the meeting times. So they go through the motion. We get their kids baptized. Then we don't see them again for about 7 years, because that's around the time they do Eucharist and reconciliation preparation, often together. And then after that, they go and they come back sometime in their teen years when they want to be confirmed, also known as Catholic graduation. And then they go off to college, and that's like the black box, right? Like, is faith going to be practiced or explored or left behind? And for those that pick it up in some way, even in a nominal way, they come home and say, well, I want to get married, and you're supposed to get married in the Catholic Church. So here's my next jump in the hopscotch game. I'm going to go to the church. I'm going to ask what the requirements are. I'm going to get the schedule. We're going to set a date. We're going to get married. And then here's where the system all ties back together. They've got a kid that they want to get baptized, and they remember, hey, my mom and dad baptized me when I was a baby. We should probably baptize our kid. Now, I'm not making light of the sacraments. I'm telling you, these are the points to start connecting and to build around, because the picture is still in there somewhere. And I think maybe that's where we could talk today about how we do that.
Yeah, and just to that point, Matt, I would say, as I'm listening to you, you're not making light of the sacraments, but the people who are just showing up as hoops to jump through aren't appreciating, they're making light of the sacraments.
Oh,
right?
Mic drop.
But we've created a church culture that allows that to happen. Anyways, that's I'm probably taking us down a slightly different path there, but just kind of as an observation, like, yeah, we have to really define the problem. I think on the other, I don't know, the other side of the coin of this, or another issue around this, is so much of what we do outside of just the sacraments, but a lot of programs that we run, Bible studies and this, and prayer groups, and, there's all kinds of different things. Years ago, I remember hearing, if what you're doing in your church isn't taking people somewhere, programs will just create religious consumers, right? Because, you show up to a men's group or a Bible study or, whatever, and, you're there. And if it's not taking you somewhere, at the end of that, you're measuring it 100% on whether you liked it or not, right? And so I go to this program. It was good. I liked it. I went to that program. I didn't like it, right? And so all you're doing is you're forming, it's like going to a restaurant. I went to that restaurant and had a good experience. I liked it. I went to that restaurant and didn't like it, didn't have a good experience. And all programs do is train people into a religious form of consumerism. Now, again, doesn't mean you go to a Bible study, you don't grow or you don't change or anything like that. But as far as the overall picture of what it's doing, it really doesn't get defined. On the other end of things, so often as church leaders, we speak into huge topics and huge subjects and expect people to take these massive leaps and massive jumps in their faith without helping them take steps to get there, right? So we talk about surrendering our lives, talk about, dying to ourselves. We talk about, walking away from sin and transformation. Like, we talk about big things. We talk about significant life change, which, again, Scripture speaks into and church history speaks into and is real, but you don't go from 1 to 10 in one step, right? And so when you look at all you're doing, in some ways you're creating religious consumerism, and the others, we're just saying, you need to change and you need to become a different person and you need to become holy. And we're like, well, but how does that happen? And when church leaders can take a step back and say, okay, what do we mean by discipleship? What does that look like here? And how are we going to help someone take doable steps to get to that place, is the question that churches need to start asking themselves and start to look at all that they're doing through that lens.
You guys both mentioned a very important piece, which I think is for the parish to first identify up front, what does a disciple mean to them when they look at their vision? What is a disciple? How does it fit into their vision? What's the expectation maybe of a disciple in their parish? Is that kind of a fair place where they would start?
I don't know. I don't know if it's still it's a starting point, but it's another dot, right? I mean, if we're talking about the journey. I love, Rob, what you said too. Maybe when we look at the dots, they seem so far apart still, right? Between baptism and First Eucharist, for instance, if it's just a sacramental dot, that can be 7 or more years. That's even a huge leap, right? There's got to be a lot of other dots connecting the way. And I think that's where we got to start looking. And so again, in what we did at our parish, just as an example, was we came up with a vision for where we wanted to take people. And in that definition of our vision was the word disciple. We wanted in there to make disciples. That wasn't our whole vision, but I know this was on discipleship. But then just putting the word disciple in the vision doesn't tell people what a disciple is, right? I mean, If you sat everybody in a room and said, let's come up with a definition of what a disciple is, and then here's the big question, are you one of those? How many answers would you come up with? People are like, well, I think so. Well, I don't know. Well, I've never thought about that before. I bet the majority of the people sitting at a church on a Mass on a Sunday have never asked whether they are a disciple or not. And you know whose fault that isn't? Theirs.
Yeah.
That's our fault. We've got to do a better job, like you just asked us, Tammy, of what is a disciple? Well, I know there's a lot of definitions. And again, like this could be one of those big things Rob talked about, like life transformation, become a disciple, right? How do they know how to do that, right? We need to help them with that. So at my parish, we actually came up with a definition, working definition. This is not in your catechism. This is not in the footnotes of your Bible, but we came up with a definition. We said, and I'll just read it to you as an example. We said disciples habitually, and I'm going to mention a lot of things here, so habitually goes with each of these. Disciples habitually worship, grow, serve, give, share their faith, live virtuously, and build community. There are 7 indicators that we came up with. Worship, grow, serve, give, share their faith, live virtuously, and build community. Now, by that definition, most people, probably me included, would look at that and say, well, I'm not a disciple because I don't do all of that habitually. But it gives us a picture of where we need to go. And it also allows a couple things. Number one, I can self-assess. How am I doing in these 7 areas? Which ones come naturally? Which ones am I crushing as a believer? Which ones do I wish weren't on the list and I really don't pay any attention to? And then also for the church leader or for those that are accompanying people on this discipleship journey, they can say, maybe where is my ministry focused? Where's another ministry focused? How can we connect those dots? And how can we help accompany people and help them assess where they are and what they need? Because disciples to do all of that, I mean, imagine if everybody did this habitually, what our churches would look like. So that's the vision, but the connecting of the dots to get there can be one indicator at a time, maybe.
Yeah, that's so good. And again, not to take us down a different path here, but I think North American culture, Western culture, we live with the myth of what the guy, a non-Catholic writer by the name of Dallas Willard, talks about discipleship-less Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. And we talk about faith and we talk about coming into a relationship with Jesus as kind of the basic and the essence of that. And discipleship is something different. It's for the extra credit. It's for those few people that have their act together, that have extra time in their schedule and can kind of pursue the extra credit sort of activities that go into being a disciple. So you have kind of this 2-tier understanding of things, which I think is an absolute lie, right? The issue isn't, are you a disciple or not? The issue is, if you have faith in Jesus, are you a good disciple or not? Really, Anyway, so pulling it back from that, I think part of what churches need to kind of wrestle with in each location, and again, to your point, Matt, I think they have to take into consideration the vision, but this isn't the vision at the same time of, how would you define a disciple in your church, and what does that exercise look like? And you'll see a couple different extremes. Is everybody will agree that around the problem, and they'll get excited about it, and then they'll go into a whiteboard and they'll list 542 things of what it means to be a disciple, and they get overwhelmed by because you can throw so much at what it means to be a disciple. You can almost have more ways to be a disciple than what the Old Testament laws had for the Israel nation, or the nation of Israel. And so taking all of that and boiling it down into something in your parish, and that's why we always say, what's it look like to be a disciple at your parish? And to start to think through, with the end in mind. I remember St. Benedict, we had at one time in our history, we had 12 markers. Different churches we worked with came up with 8 things, right? So, and it's all, what are the essential things that you can begin to look at, that you can begin to measure as happening in the life of the people in your parish, to begin to see, and then how can we lay that out so that you can take steps to it? Because I think, to your point, Matt, as we lay that out, we're going to look at it and say, well, I mean, can anybody but Jesus do that? And sometimes the answer is no, but the question isn't, are you doing it? The question is, are you being intentional about taking steps to move towards it? To me, I think that's how we have to view discipleship is we have a relationship with Jesus and we're growing into this. It's not boxes to check off that we've completed this.
Yeah, because some of those measurements come naturally, right? Like give. Well, if you ask any church, okay, who are your top givers, or how much is given on a weekend, or we got to know that because that's like the sustainability of just the maintenance of the parish, to keep the doors open.
Yep.
So it's not like we have to pour more attention into that, but connecting giving to discipleship. Now that could be its whole other podcast that I'd ask Rob McDowell to be my guest speaker on. But it's some of the things that we're not paying attention to. Sharing their faith isn't putting a bulletin in someone's mailbox or just inviting them to mass.
No.
Building community isn't just showing up for an event at the parish, right? Some of those live virtuously. Some of those are a little harder and maybe a little harder for people to measure, but they can self-assess, and you can also decide how much attention is our church putting into these. Mm-hmm. While we put a lot of great attention into celebrating the Mass well, we've put a lot of attention into like making sure we have the budget done, helping people to pray. But what about now from that, the way people live, the way they interact with others, and the way they specifically share their faith and bring people to faith? Because I like what Sherry Waddell said in her book, Forming Intentional Disciples, which I'm sure everybody that's listening to this has read. If not, that's the next thing you need to do as soon as, well, you need to stop this recording and just go read that book first. But she says, only disciples make other disciples. There's not another way to do it. A program doesn't do it. A classroom doesn't do it. Showing up for Mass doesn't make you a disciple. Only disciples. So this is about accompaniment. This is about relationship. So in between these dots, whatever the dots are, if there's not accompaniment, if there's not relationships, then we're not actually making disciples.
And that's what I was thinking too, is it's very relationship based. When you think about when Jesus walked on earth here, he wasn't offering programs to bring people into discipleship and events per se. He was journeying with them, and what that looked like from when he first introduced himself to them to when they were further on along the journey would have looked differently as he led them deeper and deeper into discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
One of the dangers of this, as you put a discipleship pathway together, is there will be a structure. And again, structure is always dangerous because you can start to serve the structure rather than the structure serving you. But to that point, a guy that wrote a book on creating discipleship pathways was a guy by the name of Daniel Im. And he said the goal of your pathway isn't to get people through it. It's to help them own it and to help them understand it and own it. Right. And owning it and understanding is that relational piece of where they're getting the vision. And when they own this, that's when you start to really kind of create a discipling culture, right? Because they see the bigger picture, that the goal of this isn't to just satisfy and check the boxes and fulfill the structure, but you do lay out a structure to help people experience the discipleship, the relationship, the life change that you want them to experience as disciples.
But I was putting some pre-thought into our podcast this morning. That was kind of the first key thing that stood out to me, was that to being a disciple is knowing that you're in need of a savior. And I was thinking about that question that Jesus asks multiple times in scripture is, what do you want for me to do for you? So first of all, we have to be able to answer that question before even venturing out on a journey of discipleship, right? Do we acknowledge first that we need somebody other than ourselves?
Yeah, such a great point. Because again, the beginning point of a life of discipleship, of becoming a disciple, is having a relationship with Jesus, right? And you might be able to gain some knowledge, you might be able to learn some things, you might be able to be a religious person, but you will never be a disciple without that relationship. And that relationship's the beginning point of discipleship. And then after that, again, it's not about, it's not about the activities and jumping through the hoops. It's how can I continue to help that relationship grow and feed that relationship,
right?
Both with Jesus and others in the church. I think there's, three primary ways that we could look at the relational. It's our relationship with God, our relationship with others in the church, and our relationship with people in the world. Like, are we living in a way that we're growing in love for God, we're growing in love for others, and we're serving on mission and stepping into letting that love change and transform us into people that are intentional about our influence and living on mission. Because if at the end of the day, our discipleship pathway isn't changing us and helping us love the people around us more, then we're just becoming Pharisees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even on a positive spin, maybe consumers, right? Which is where we are. Yeah. And you realize there's two sides of this, right? It's the people that are coming to faith or to the church. And sometimes that can be one and the same. Sometimes those are very different groups.
Yep.
People coming to the church are already those consumers. And how many people in the church have the church right where they want it?
Yep.
It's working for them. They don't want to change it, right? Mm-hmm. Those that are employed at the church are driving the vision and the mission of the church, or volunteering in ministry, or whatever that case may be. They too have been hired with maybe a job or empowered with a role. And so they're fulfilling that specific role. My job, my role is the usher on Sunday at Mass. And so that's the hole they fill. Right? And thank you all ushers and stewards around the world for doing your ministry, because I know not everybody's just plugging a hole. But what ends up happening is people see that as a fulfillment of their baptismal call and their call to be a disciple. And so all we would have then is a bunch of people fulfilling their call to be a disciple in a specific spot along the journey. But nobody's connecting the dots still. That's the problem. Nobody takes take someone with the best intentions to start an outward facing, to go beyond the consumer, to reach new people. So they start an evangelization process like Alpha. And so they start that. Well, then once Alpha's done, all those people are doing Alpha, like, hey, they're great. They're doing all the thing. And then people are done with Alpha. They're like, okay, let's gear up for the next one. Well, what about that 20 or 200 people that just went through Alpha? Who's walking with them to the next step? Because here's not the answer, Catholic churches. Don't take your Alpha graduates and throw them into RCIA. That's the next dot for so many, right? Because they don't see the dots in between. So it's, well, we started Alpha. Well, back to the regularly scheduled program, RCIA. And now at RCIA, well, regularly scheduled program, show up for Mass on Sunday. Maybe those are next steps, but how many of the people that just come out of Alpha are those the next two steps for them? Yeah. We don't know if we're not accompanying them. And I think this is where any church that's on mission, any church that's listening to this podcast, any church that's begun the process, even some of those that have been doing it for years, we need to pay attention to what we do with people when they're done with one thing. This is just maybe an easy spot to start assessing. When they're done with one thing, how do they get to the next thing? And it's not an announcement or a bulletin or a pulpit announcement. Are they accompanied to the next thing? How are we assessing what the next thing is before we just throw them to the next dot?
I'm thinking about this too. It's not even it's more than connecting dots. When I think about, okay, so what if as a parish we decided one of the things included in our definition of a disciple is somebody that knows how to pray, and as they grow in discipleship is comfortable praying with others. So we're not going to offer them a program per se necessarily on how to pray. So what does that look like to accompany someone to the point that they're comfortable praying with others?
That's where we have to step back and say, okay, what environments are we creating for people, not just what programs? Because again, you could have a how to pray 101, right? And we'll teach people the Lord's Prayer and other great prayers, and then we say at the end, okay, you go do it, all right? And we just kind of again drop them in the deep end of the pool. Or is there another environment where, and I think Alpha does this a little bit in some of their weeks, but you can continue to do this in environments. How do I make it safe for someone to pray the first time? How do I make it safe for people to pray around others the first time? How do I, and what can I do? How can I model? How can I encourage? Because that's less about the information and more about creating an environment of safety. And so as you're thinking about the steps, so if we were, the three of us were in a small group or something like that, and, Tammy, you were leading the group and me and Matt were intimidated by praying, what could you do? as an intentional step to say, you know what, it's normal for disciples to pray. It's normal for disciples to pray out loud around other people. Maybe that's part of how you define discipleship. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But then say, okay, Tammy is a leader, and to your point, Matt, kind of accompanying us, what could you do to make prayer safe, normal, and give us the space to experiment with it? And and I don't think you're ever going to fail when you're trying to pray, but in some people's minds, as it doesn't go the way I imagine it, they'll feel like a failure sometimes, or they'll be embarrassed, and to make those experiences normal for people to move forward. So I think that's part of what has to kind of undergird whatever discipleship pathway churches develop. It isn't just what we want them to do, but what's the environment? How are people walking with them? How are we making it safe to experiment and try things that give us the actual space to grow and move forward? So good. That's so good. Yeah, I love that it's about the environment. It's the posture, right? It's not the program. That's so good, Rob. That's so true. And it's so hard because so many people are like, the knee-jerk reaction at a parish is, well, we want people to pray together. How about I start a class on Wednesday nights about praying with people? And maybe that's helpful at some level, but that's our knee-jerk reaction, is do another class, give people the steps instead of doing it. I remember I was at a student conference. This is probably one of the first times, this is years ago, where it really resonated with me. It was after I'd given one of the talks, and people wanted to come talk afterward, right? That's just what happens after, you've given a talk, people have related to it, or they want to tell you something or ask you a question. And so there's this like line of teenagers. And I'm like, oh man, I started thinking with my process brain, how do I get through all of them in the next 10 minutes so I can get on to the next thing? And I remember the first person that came up, and she was sharing with me, I'd shared about a struggle I'd gone through in my life, and she said that really resonated with her because she'd experienced a struggle and she wasn't sure what to do. So it wasn't just, hey, great talk. It was like she connected in a way, and now she's wrestling internally with where she is, that's the best compliment any speaker could get, right? Is here's how it's resonating in me and what it's calling me to do. And she said to me, would you pray for me? Well, in my process brain, I would have said, sure, next person. But in this moment, I said, you know what? I should model this. I should do it because number one, I'm probably going to forget. But number two, how do I model this for her and for other people? So I said, can we just pray right now? Line of people, busy auditorium. Can we just pray right now? And I just prayed 20, 30 seconds with her, and like tears coming down her eyes, not because of the prayer I said, but because of the intention, like this moment where she's really like encountering the Lord in this moment. And I was so touched by it, and it changed me. I said, you know what? Anytime someone asks me to pray for them now, I'm not just going to say, I might say this in addition. Hey, I'll add you to my prayer list. Can we pray now for that? Could we pray together? And that's a posture, right? And that's something that had to grow in me. I had to do it intentionally, and it felt awkward at first until it didn't feel awkward anymore. So that's what environment happens too, right? Like we've got to choose this for a while and lean into it and keep doing it until it's normalized, until it becomes cultural, until you see other people doing it in the community too.
Yeah, and I think that will help to fill that between the points in the bigger puzzle, right? Accompaniment piece.
Every church, and sometimes people will incorporate this into a discipleship pathway, but there's really two fundamental systems that you want to think through: is discipleship pathway, how are you going to help people become disciples? And then a leadership pipeline, how are we going to grow people in their leadership and their influence? Some churches keep those separate, but a lot of churches will integrate the two into kind of one system. And part of what you were kind of speaking into there was as a leader, you were growing in how you were leading someone. In that context, you weren't running a program, you were praying with someone afterwards. But part of what we have to understand in all of this is, for many of us, our discipleship is going to be in the context of leading others, and how we grow in leadership and how we grow in serving others at a certain point is probably not the only way. And I think that it could be dangerous making this the only way, what we're doing for others. But primarily the key way that we're going to grow as disciples is in the context of serving others. And so the discipleship pathway at a certain point flips to where we own the pathway for more of a serving perspective, right? And so it's not like, again, we arrive at this place, we're now leaders, we've checked all the boxes, we've completed everything, and now we're able to do it. No, you continue to grow in a serving context, not just in a receiving, passive context of what you're getting in the intake that you're receiving.
Yeah, it's a good point about the connection to leadership and leaders needing to lead others, accompany others through the process as well. So I'm wanting to ask about the role of the pastor in all this. So I'm thinking something else that we often speak or that we coach into is missional preaching. So how does the role that the priest has as the leader of the church use that platform to tie all this together?
Yeah, it's certainly key to it that, as we talk about preaching as the number one leadership tool that each of the pastors and priests have, to regularly kind of cast vision for it, speak into it, help people understand the different aspects of your pathway as you kind of develop them, and not something that's kind of just off to the side that has no involvement in your weekend communication. And I think at the end of the day, as a pastor as well, you have to ask yourself, like, is this is something that you have to own and integrate into your priesthood? This can't be something that, we've got this staff person, we have this leader, they own it, so that's all happening over there, and I'm over here doing this thing. There's got to be an integrative understanding as to how this influences and shapes your leadership as the priest. Again, doesn't mean that you're implementing all of this and doing all of it, but you do own it and understand it, and it is coming from your leadership.
I had a great conversation with one of the priests that I get to coach, Father Nick Desimoni, and he wouldn't mind me sharing his name here because he's actually helped us make a video about this. And it was really around, it was around vision. And what he does at his parish now, when he sits down with his staff and his volunteers, they ask this key question as to everything they do. How is this making disciples? That's the question they're like ready to answer every time. Now, that doesn't mean that everything they do is that first initial point of making a disciple, right? Because that's an important point, which I don't think we do hardly anything around typically at most churches. But how is it continuing? Maybe if you want to use some indicators like we've talked about, like those 7 indicators at my parish or the 12 that St. Benedict's had. How is what we're doing fulfilling that? And so he would ask them before they do a program, before they do an event, before they'd offer any sort of resource, how is this making disciples? And a couple things would happen. Either they could give him a really clear answer and they could invest some more energy, time, money, resources into that. They'd give a very muddled answer, which means if they're not clear about it, there's no way the disciple they're trying to make is going to get clear about it. So it might just challenge them to get clearer about it or tweak a couple things. Or if there was no answer at all, you know what they did? Not that. They stopped doing that. So yes, that's kind of vision related, but it has to be, there has to be some sort of anchor, right? Or some sort of picture. So when we're doing all the busyness of a parish, Father Nick and his team, how does that make disciples? And that's not a question I don't think, I don't think we can ask enough. I think that's something that maybe should be a regular checkpoint or a litmus test. Are we making disciples by doing this? Is this moving someone further along in their spiritual walk with Jesus by doing this? Many of the things we're doing right now, you could say yes, but again, then we've got to start figuring out how to do the handoff and lead them to the next spot.
It speaks to the idea of measuring outcomes. And in some ways, this is where we always have to talk about measuring in a couple different ways. There's the quantitative, which is the numbers, like how many people showed up, how many gave, all that sort of stuff, which tends to be the easier. There's also the qualitative, right, which tends to be a little bit more subjective. It's rooted in experience. It's rooted in life change that sometimes can't always be measured, right? And so churches need to learn, or churches, but church leadership teams in particular need to learn to how to have good conversations around outcomes and measuring and learning to talk through what this looks like. Because, to your point, Matt, around that. Does this create disciples or not? A lot of times early on, that will be a hard conversation because they'll see a lot of good stuff happening, but they won't always have the language for it. They won't always be able to speak into it. Or they'll just assume that good stuff is happening because, there's religious stuff going on, so I assume there's good things that are coming out of it without actually learning how to grow in their understanding of measuring, grow in their understanding of how to speak into that, and learn how to identify when those things are happening. And I always go to Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit. And, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. Probably one or two more in there that I missed. But anyways, the St. Paul talks about these things, and he's I don't believe he's giving us outcomes that we just hope are happening. I think he's giving us outcomes that he believes people should be able to identify in themselves. But yet at the same time, it's a subjective outcome. And so we need to get more comfortable having conversations around these things to be able to speak into what I think is more, a little bit more subjective in nature, and sometimes a little bit more challenging around each of these things, because we're used to measuring numbers. And so we'll look at everything purely from a numerical standpoint. And again, we shouldn't ignore the numerical. We should be aware of it, but the numerical shouldn't always define everything for us either. And so learning how to have good, healthy conversations around outcomes and measurements and things like that. And that will sound challenging for some people, but I think the New Testament points us towards having those types of conversations.
Mm-hmm. As you talk about the pastors, what else they can do, Tammy? I mean, obviously Sunday is where most of your constituents, where they get to hear from you. Existing constituents, let me say that correctly, because the constituents are people in the neighborhood still too, and in the area that might not have even come to the church yet, or maybe visited once. Last night, we had the pastor for our neighborhood church over for dinner. And, it's funny when you have somebody like that over, you want the house to be clean and your kids to have clean shirts on and like the table to be set and the food to be warm. So you pay attention to that stuff, but it's like put on the perfect face, right? And I was struck when he came, when we really got into some conversation. I mean, the kids wanted to tell stories, but then we just started talking about the church a little bit, of course. I'm like, this is not my sales call, but hey, let's talk a little bit more about what's going on there. And you know what he said to me? He said, I want people to know Jesus and to fall in love with him. He just said it so simply and specifically. I'm like, Father, could I help you with your next homily? Now, he doesn't need any help. He's a good preacher. But that's the message, right? If we can start from the pulpit, from the ambo, from the front of the room, wherever, if that becomes the message from the pastor, then people that do the ministries can hear that. Okay, if the litmus test, maybe we don't know, if we've made a disciple, are they coming to know and love Jesus? Let's start there. Let's use that as some sort of assessment for how well we're doing. Father James in his first book, he kind of indicts a couple groups at the front of the book. We've got these groups holed up in churches that we're not really about knowing and loving Jesus. And that's our mission. That's our mission.
Speaking of mission, that's a good wrap-up point, since that's what we started with, the mission to go out and make disciples. Anything else you wanted to say, Rob or Matt, that we may have missed?
No, I mean, just at a high level, and it's easy to say this, but I'd say, it's 3 steps kind of in this process is, define what a disciple looks like, move from programs to steps, and learn to align or eliminate all your ministries around those things. There's a lot that goes into those 3 steps, but kind of as we leave here today, if we're to kind of summarize where it is we've kind of gone in the conversation, those would be kind of the 3 steps to summarize from kind of a big picture perspective of how pastors and leadership teams can kind of start to wrestle through some of this stuff.
And, a lot of people, I'd add to that, Rob, too. A lot of people want to start with a discipleship pathway. Let's define what that looks like. And like you said, discipleship pathways are great. They shouldn't be the first step. But if you want to wrestle with it, I would say if it is a first step, if you're hitting the ground running, you've already developed a discipleship pathway before you've even filled it out. Then what you can start to do is look at those kind of stops along the journey at the dots, right? like pre-evangelization, evangelization, discipleship, formation, catechesis, mission and service, whatever they are, worship. Put them there and start to assess how are we doing in these areas first. And I bet you'll see in some areas, oh, well, that's where 80% of our energy goes. And we have 0% in the pre-evangelization, 4% in evangelization, 80% in formation, catechesis. Look at how you're spending your time, energy, resources, manpower, ministries, programs. And then maybe that'll give you a way to look at the areas that you're not doing anything about now. Because if you have a discipleship pathway, it has to move. There has to be a way to get from one to the other. It can't just be a couple stops. So that can help you assess how you're doing. And then, of course, like you said, Rob, I think as you move into the accompaniment piece is really where you move away from programs into service, into ministry. And that's to pay attention to how you get people from point A to point B.
And maybe if I can offer a word of encouragement is to go for it, to start developing this stuff, but acknowledge that you're not necessarily going to get it right the first time. And the accompaniment can grow and change the more that you learn and grow yourselves. So don't be locked into needing to get a right pathway. Just allow yourself to learn it and grow from the experience and adapt.
Tammy, one thing on that point, which is good,
Go for it.
is so know the difference between internal and external communication around this. Don't show up at a Sunday and throw it up on a screen or hand out flyers in the back and say, here's our new pathway if you're not sure and you don't know how you're going to do it. Start with the leader. Start with wrestle with it internally. See what's working before you just cast it out and now you're married to it, or people now they become the judge. Like, yeah, well, you're not doing that very well. Yeah, or you let me down here. Yeah, we're going to do that. But it'd be better to struggle with it a little internally before you go externally. And that's a conversation I have a lot of parishes is, should our discipleship pathway be on the back of our, bulletin or on a banner or somewhere? Maybe, but that shouldn't be step 1, 2, or 3.
Good point. So we reference a lot of great books today to add those to the show notes. And of course, we always invite your comments that you can engage with others if this was a topic that struck a chord maybe with you. So you have ideas that you want to share with others. And of course, we always enjoy reading your comments as well. So thanks for joining us for our conversation today. And we hope to see you again during our next session. Thanks and God bless.